Imagine a war zone so cut off from the world that even hope had to be smuggled in. In 1969, deep inside the dense forests of southeastern Nigeria, the breakaway Republic of Biafra was dying. For nearly 2 years, the Nigerian Federal Army had surrounded it, choking off roads, ports, and airfields. Famine had become a weapon. Children's bellies swelled with hunger, while the world watched the tragedy unfold on black and white television. But amid the despair, in a hidden clearing that smelled of oil, sweat, and rain, a group of men worked in silence around a small white airplane. It was no fighter jets, no bomber, not even military at all. It was a Swedish trainer plane, light as a car and barely longer than a truck. Yet these men believed they could turn it into a weapon powerful enough to change the course of a war. That belief gave birth to one of the most extraordinary stories of improvisation in modern history, the story of the Biafra Baby, the tiny plane built in a jungle workshop that bombed an oil refinery and startled the world. To understand how that moment came to be, we have to return to the chaos that created it. Nigeria had been independent for only a few years when its fragile unity cracked. Ethnic tensions, political coups, and massacres pushed the eastern region, dominated by the Igbo people, to declare independence in 1967. They called their new nation Biafra. The declaration ignited a civil war. Nigeria's army, better equipped and internationally recognized, launched a campaign to crush the rebellion. Britain and the Soviet Union supplied weapons to the federal side. Biafra, isolated and desperate, fought with what it could build, salvage, or smuggle. The air war was merciless. Nigerian jets, MiG-17 fighters, and Il-28 bombers, supplied by Moscow, swept over towns almost daily. Markets, hospitals, even Red Cross depots were hit. Each new explosion drove thousands more civilians into starvation and fear. Among the few foreigners who refused to look away was Count Carl Gustav von Rosen, a tall, calm-spoken Swede with piercing eyes and a pilot's bearing. He had flown relief missions for the Red Cross, delivering food and medicine under fire. He had seen the bombed orphanages, the skeletal children, the craters where villages once stood. And something in him broke. Von Rosen came from one of Sweden's most famous families. He was an aristocrat, an adventurer, and above all, a pilot. In his youth, he had flown for Ethiopia against Mussolini's invasion. Later, he became a commercial airline captain. He was also a humanitarian idealist, a man who believed that technology, used ethically, could serve justice. But in Biafra, he saw technology used for slaughter. The same aircraft that once thrilled him as machines of beauty now terrorized civilians. So he made a decision that blurred the line between humanitarian and soldier. If no one would defend the helpless, he would. Using personal connections in Sweden, von Rosen quietly purchased 5 small civilian aircraft. The Malmö MFI-9B Minicoin, a 2-seat trainer that looked harmless enough for flying clubs. Officially, the planes were destined for agricultural work. In reality, they were bound for a war zone. The name Minicoin stood for Miniature Counterinsurgency, an experimental light attack concept born in the 1960s. The MFI-9B could carry a few rockets or small bombs, fly low and slow, and land almost anywhere. On paper, it was laughably underpowered for combat. But von Rosen saw something the generals did not. Simplicity could be a strength. The planes were disassembled, loaded into cargo aircraft, and flown covertly to Gabon, one of the few African nations sympathetic to Biafra. From there, they were smuggled piece by piece across the border, hidden beneath tarps and sacks of grain, until they reached a secret airstrip carved into the jungle. The hangar was nothing more than a thatched roof over a mud floor. The mechanics, Biafran volunteers, a few expatriate engineers, and von Rosen himself worked day and night under the humming chorus of insects. They had no factory tools, no assembly manuals, no spare parts. Every bolt, every wire had to be improvised. They painted the planes in 2 shades of green so they would vanish against the canopy. Each aircraft was given a Biafran insignia, a rising sun, and a nickname, Biafra Baby, 1 through 5. The men laughed at the name at first, but it stuck. These tiny planes would soon sting a giant. Under each wing, they fitted 2 pods, carrying 6 68mm rockets. The same unguided projectiles, fired from helicopters. A simple metal sight was welded onto the windshield frame. The cockpits were stripped of anything non-essential to save weight. To extend range, they added an extra fuel tank behind the seat. When they finished, the fleet looked almost toy-like. Yet, in those fragile wings, lay Biafra's only chance to strike back. The target was chosen carefully. The Port Harcourt oil refinery, the beating heart of Nigeria's war economy. It supplied the fuel that kept the Federal Army's trucks, tanks, and aircraft moving. If they could knock it out, even temporarily, Biafra might gain breathing space and prove to the world that it was not yet defeated. The operation was scheduled for the early morning of 22nd May, 1969. 5 planes, 5 pilots, 3 Swedes, 2 Biafrans would fly at treetop height from the jungle strip to the coast, unleash their rockets, and vanish before the Nigerians could react. There would be no radio contact, no radar guidance, no backup plan. Each pilot carried a simple map, drawn by hand, and a compass taped to the dashboard. Their altimeters were barely reliable. The only thing certain was danger. At dawn, the pilots gathered around von Rosen. He spoke quietly. "We fight not for conquest, but so that children can sleep without fear." The engines coughed to life, one after another. The sound was soft, almost gentle compared with the roar of jets. Then the planes lifted off into the mist. The morning sky over the Niger Delta was pale blue, streaked with thin mist from the mangroves. As the 5 little planes flew in tight formation, barely 50 feet above the ground, their shadows rippled over the jungle canopy. To any Nigerian radar operator, the screens were blank. The aircraft were too low to register. Von Rosen led from the front. Behind him, the 4 other Biafra babies followed silently, their engines humming like insects. Beneath them, the landscape changed from forest to swamp to the glittering edge of the Atlantic. Ahead lay the oil refinery, a maze of tanks, pipes, and flames that marked Port Harcourt's coastline. They had rehearsed the approach again and again on maps scratched in the dirt. Now it was real. At 6:30 a.m., the formation rose slightly above the tree line. For a moment, the refinery workers below looked up in confusion. What were those tiny planes? Crop dusters, survey aircraft. Then the first rockets streaked out. The explosion ripped through the morning calm. Seconds later, more rockets screamed into the tank farm. Fireballs erupted, one after another, turning the sky into a rolling wall of black smoke. Flames spread through the refinery's pipelines like veins of light. Von Rosen's voice, steady over the intercom, "Hit your marks and turn out." No second runs. Within minutes, the tiny planes banked away and disappeared back into the clouds, hugging the treetops once more. The entire attack had lasted less than 5 minutes. On the ground, chaos reigned. Nigerian anti-aircraft crews fired wildly into the empty sky, expecting jets. They could not believe what had happened. 5 miniature aircraft had slipped through one of the most defended airspaces in the country and destroyed the nation's primary fuel supply. When the smoke cleared, several MiG fighters parked nearby were wrecked. The refinery was crippled. The shock was not just tactical, it was psychological. Nigeria's air superiority had been humiliated by what looked like toys. News of the attack spread rapidly. At first, reports were dismissed as propaganda. How could a breakaway enclave build and fly its own air force? But satellite images and international correspondence confirmed the truth. The story made front pages from London to New York. Tiny planes bomb Nigerian oil facility. For a brief moment, Biafra's cause was back in the headlines, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance. People around the world began to look again at a conflict they had almost forgotten. Relief agencies received a surge of donations. Even politicians who had quietly supported the Nigerian government were forced to question their assumptions. Inside Biafra, the reaction bordered on euphoria. Radio Biafra broadcast triumphant news bulletins, describing the attack as proof that ingenuity and courage could overcome overwhelming odds. In villages, children sang songs about the babies that stung the giants. But von Rosen remained calm. He knew this was no miracle weapon. It was a message. And messages, no matter how powerful, fade if not followed by action. He immediately planned a second strike, a coordinated assault on several airfields where Nigerian bombers were based. Over the following weeks, the Biafra Babies launched at least 2 more missions, targeting runways and aircraft at Benin City, Enugu, and other locations. They destroyed or damaged multiple enemy planes, forcing the Nigerian Air Force to move its assets farther from the front. The missions were exhausting. Pilots flew for hours over featureless jungle, with no instruments reliable enough for navigation. The heat inside the cockpit was unbearable. If an engine failed, there would be no rescue. The swamps below swallowed everything. Von Rosen kept meticulous notes after each sortie: fuel consumption, rocket accuracy, radio interference. He treated the project like an experiment in what he called human-scale warfare. To him, the small planes represented a more moral way of fighting, precise, personal, less destructive to civilians. In private, though, he admitted to friends that the cost was mounting. Each flight risked not only the pilots' lives, but Biafra's last remaining link to the outside world. Supplies were running out. Every gallon of fuel used in an attack meant one less for relief flights, bringing in medicine and food. Still, he flew. He once wrote, "If a man must choose between inaction in the face of evil or taking flight with what little he has, he must fly." By mid-1969, Nigeria had adapted. Radar coverage improved. MiG fighters began patrolling lower altitudes. Anti-aircraft guns were redeployed near key facilities. The window of surprise that had protected the Biafra Babies was closing. During one raid, a Nigerian jet caught sight of the tiny planes and dove to attack, but its speed worked against it. The MiG overshot, unable to turn tightly enough to engage the slow MFI-9S. The irony was not lost on von Rosen. Technology built for dominance was useless against machines designed in simplicity. Yet the odds were insurmountable. By the end of the summer, 2 of the 5 Biafra babies were lost to accidents and ground fire. Spare parts were non-existent. The jungle workshop struggled just to keep the remaining aircraft operational. In September, von Rosen decided to hand control of the remaining planes to trained Biafran pilots. He wanted them to carry on the mission after we left. For several more weeks, the small aircraft continued harassment flights, striking fuel depots, convoys, and runways. But their impact was diminishing. Each flight consumed precious resources. Each success brought harsher retaliation. The Nigerian forces launched relentless offensives, pushing deeper into Biafran territory. Refugee camps multiplied. Hunger became the greatest enemy once again. Von Rosen's story captured imaginations far beyond Africa. In Europe, he was hailed by some as a hero, a modern knight who had defended the weak when governments would not. Others criticized him as a reckless adventurer meddling in foreign wars. He rejected both labels. "I am neither mercenary nor saint," he said in an interview years later. "I simply did what conscience demanded." When international pressure forced Sweden to distance itself from his actions, he resigned from official duties and continued humanitarian flights under neutral agencies. His reputation at home was complicated, but among the people of Biafra, his name became legend. Parents told their children stories of the Swedish pilot who came from the sky not to bomb them, but to defend them. The Port Harcourt refinery eventually recovered, rebuilt under heavy guard. But for months, Nigeria's fuel distribution faltered. Convoys stalled. Aircraft sorties were reduced. The psychological blow lingered far longer than the physical damage. International observers later called it the most effective light air operation of the post-war era. Military academies studied it as an example of asymmetric innovation, how small, low-tech forces could achieve strategic surprise through creativity. Yet the human side remained the most striking. The engineers who built the planes in that muddy jungle shed never saw fame or fortune. Many went back to civilian life, carrying only the memory of nights spent hammering metal under lanterns while the war thundered in the distance. By early 1970, the war was nearing its end. Starved, isolated, and vastly outnumbered, Biafra surrendered. The little air force that had once defied jets and bombers was gone. The remaining MFI-9s were either captured, destroyed, or hidden. Von Rosen had already left, continuing humanitarian work in Africa until his death, years later, in Ethiopia. The dream of an independent Biafra faded, but the idea of what those planes represented did not. They showed that ingenuity could flourish even in desperation, that courage could exist without resources, and that technology's true power depends on the hands that wield it. When the guns finally fell silent in January 1970, the land that had once called itself Biafra was in ruins. The towns were shells of concrete and ash. The airstrips were pitted craters, overgrown with weeds. Millions of civilians had died from starvation or disease. For most of the world, the story ended there. Another African tragedy, filed away and forgotten. But among those who lived through it, one detail survived in memory: the little planes that had appeared out of nowhere, roaring low over the trees, striking hard and disappearing into the mist. They called them Biafra Babies. To the pilots, they were fragile machines of hope. To the people below, they were proof that even in a war built on despair, ingenuity could still lift men from the ground. In the months after the surrender, wreckage of one of the aircrafts was found near a riverbank. Its green paint faded, its wings peppered with bullet holes. Children climbed on it and played as if it were a jungle gym, not realizing that only months earlier it had been part of a daring experiment in survival. And perhaps that is the truest image of the Biafra babies. The machines of war returned to peace, quietly rusting under the sun while life moved on around them. Historians later struggled to categorize von Rosen's campaign. Was it military innovation, humanitarian intervention, or simply one man's rebellion against the cruelty of modern war? The answer is all three. Von Rosen's belief in human-scale warfare set him apart. In an age that worshipped bigger bombs, faster jets, and mass destruction, he imagined a form of combat that was almost artisanal, small, precise, controlled by conscience. The MFI-9B, in his eyes, was not a tool of conquest but a reminder that technology could be personal again. It is easy to forget that these aircraft were built with hand tools in a clearing. The men who worked there mixed aviation fuel from drums, cut sheet metal with saws meant for furniture, and used local wood to reinforce the landing gear. Their workshop smelled of sweat and sap, not of machinery. And yet those planes flew, not just once, but repeatedly, and changed the rhythm of a national war. In a later interview, von Rosen said, "We proved that imagination can sometimes be more powerful than industry. You cannot blockade imagination." He meant it literally. The blockade that starved Biafra could not choke the idea that a few determined people might fight back with brains instead of factories. Military engineers who studied the Biafra babies after the war were astonished at their efficiency. Each aircraft had cost less than a single anti-aircraft shell, yet together they had achieved results that multi-million-dollar machines could not. They were precursors to what we now call light attack aircraft, a category that would later include planes like the A-37 Dragonfly and the Super Tucano. Von Rosen's Jungle Fleet was a prototype for an idea that would return de jure decades later in counterinsurgency doctrine. Small, agile, low-cost aircraft supporting troops in irregular warfare. What began as desperation became foresight. Still, von Rosen never claimed to be an inventor of weapons. He spoke instead about morality. "If you must fight," he wrote, "fight with as little suffering as possible. A small plane carrying 6 rockets cannot wipe out a city. A jet carrying bombs can. Choose the small one." That principle would echo quietly among humanitarian pilots, peacekeepers, and aid workers who knew his story. They saw in him not a warrior, but a man trying to restore scale and sanity to conflict. After Biafra, von Rosen continued to fly relief missions across Africa. He served in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan, always where people were suffering and governments turned away. His flights carried food, medicine, and refugees. Never again weapons. In 1977, while on a humanitarian mission in Ethiopia, his aircraft was attacked by rebels. He was killed instantly. He died doing exactly what he had always done, flying into danger for the sake of others. When word of his death reached Nigeria, something remarkable happened. Even men who had once fought against his Biafran raids sent condolences. A retired Nigerian officer was quoted saying, He was our enemy, but he fought like a man with a conscience. The world could use more enemies like that. Today, few physical traces of the Biafra babies remain. A handful of black and white photographs survive. The small green aircraft lined up in the jungle, rockets slung under their wings, pilots in rolled-up sleeves smiling at the camera. One or two fragments of fuselage are kept in private collections. Most of the people who built them have passed away. Yet the story endures in oral histories, documentaries, and the memories of those who were children in that war. They remember the deep drone of the engines, the sudden roar, the streaks of light over Port Harcourt. For them, those sounds meant not fear, but defiance. There is a kind of poetry in that reversal. For once, an aircraft meant protection, not destruction. In a continent where air raid was usually a synonym for tragedy, the Biafra babies gave the sky back to the people, if only for a fleeting season. The deeper legacy of the Biafran jet story lies not in technology, but in psychology. It challenged the idea that power belongs only to those with size, wealth, or backing from superpowers. It suggested that ingenuity and moral conviction could still shape outcomes, even if only briefly. When analysts discuss modern asymmetric warfare, from homemade drones to guerrilla engineering, they often trace the philosophy back to examples like von Rosen's, not because of their scale, but because they show that imagination can rewrite the rules. The jungle workshop in Biafra became a symbol of resourcefulness under pressure, a metaphor for creativity against oppression. In classrooms across Africa, a few teachers still mention it when talking about innovation. If they could build an air force in the bush, one said, what excuse do we have not to build something better in peace? Every war leaves stories of destruction. The Biafran War left millions. But tucked inside its devastation was a rare story of invention, born not from hate, but from compassion. Von Rosen's airplanes were built because he could not stand to see children bombed. His solution was paradoxical: to fight bombing with bombing. Yet in his mind, it was the only way to restore balance when the world's conscience had failed. That paradox remains uncomfortable today. Can violence ever serve humanity? Can invention built for killing ever be moral? Von Rosen never offered a perfect answer. He only offered action. He once said, doing nothing is also a choice, often the worst one. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. It forces us to confront our own thresholds of involvement, our own definitions of courage. It reminds us that sometimes the right thing is not clear, but it must still be attempted. In recent years, aviation historians have begun to re-examine the Biafra operation. Museums in Sweden and Nigeria have discussed joint exhibits. The surviving photographs are being restored. A small model of the MFY-9B sits in a Swedish air museum, painted in green camouflage with tiny rocket pods beneath its wings. The placard beside it reads simply, "The Biafra Baby, built in the jungle, flown for humanity." Visitors often stop, puzzled. Few have heard the story, but when they read it, they linger. The idea that something so small, built in secrecy under palm leaves, could humble a modern air force feels almost mythical in an age of satellites and drones. It speaks to something timeless, the belief that courage can still surprise the powerful. If you walk today through the forests of southeastern Nigeria, the jungle has long reclaimed the old airstrips. Grass hides the runways. Trees rise where planes once stood. Yet on some quiet evenings, villagers say that when the wind shifts just right, you can still hear a faint engine hum rolling over the treetops, like the echo of those five tiny planes that once defied the impossible. Whether that sound is real or imagined doesn't matter. What matters is that people still remember. They remember that once, in a time of hunger and despair, a handful of men looked at the sky and refused to surrender it. They built wings out of scrap and willpower, and for a brief, blazing moment, they made the world look up in awe. That is the legacy of the Biafra babies. Not power, not victory, but proof that the human spirit, even when cornered by cruelty, can still choose to create. They were built in a jungle, flown by dreamers, and remembered forever as the little planes that dared to fight giants.